Hello, this is Michael Hexter, and welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So this episode I'm calling Biden, Yellen, and Jerome Powell's respectable fantasy economics is powerless in the debt ceiling fiasco. So what I'm doing here with this title and also this episode is I'm obviously trying to link and compress a few set of ideas that I've been working on and off over the last several years and also last decade and a half or so, but also applied to the current situation, current conjuncture in the combination of the Congress and the federal government's, or the Federal Reserve, and also the various other fiscal agencies, the Department of Treasury, so forth and so on, within the government. And also, but I'm making reference really to something I'm calling fantasy economics. So in calling something fantasy economics, I'm making claims for myself and my view, or my school's view of the economy. My school is modern monetary theory, and my eclectic version of that, or focus within that school of political economy, let's call it. And I'm making claims that, there are also other, I think, quote unquote, reality based economics or reality based points of view within economics. But I'm making claims that my view and some other people's views is more realistic and more reality based, and also fundamentally more useful than the respectable mainstream, what I'm calling fantasy economics. I made a reference in a recent episode to the right wing's fantasy economics, and that's more filled with fantastic sort of superpower kind of views of very rich people, and of sort of a worship of wealth, and the with the they don't call it this anymore, but trickle down economics, the idea that somehow piling on financial incentives in the form of tax cuts, and also other emoluments to the very wealthy and essentially people who are investors, that will create prosperity and will solve all economic problems eventually. Anyway, but this more respectable, what I'm calling fantasy economics, is really broadly shared among certain ideological institutions within the broader political economy, including the mainstream portion of the economics profession, and also its products, for instance, Janet Yellen, and also people who, while they are not formally economists, like, for instance, Joe Biden or Jerome Powell, he's a lawyer, they are people who act within the framework of and refer to this shared fantasy economics that they work in. And allow me to take a step back and make an argument for this being a fantasy economics by observing how how academic economics is actually used within business, and also within government. In other words, it's actually not really used. In other words, it's not useful for the most part, either within business, the private sector, or within the public sector. But it creates this veil over, again, recent episodes have talked about squid like activity by people who generate discourse, and so creating a confusing cloud of ideas and images and narratives that distract from the most, what I believe, and I think many people believe or feel, intuit, sense, are the most important things that are happening right now in our economy and in society overall. And so this fantasy economics is a is something that is generated by the academic um, uh, economics infrastructure. It's the graduate schools that create economists, so forth and so on. There is very little within academic economics that is reality based. There are certain chunks of reality, certain pieces of reality that poke through, okay, mainstream economics. It's not all garbage. It's not all obfuscation, but a lot of it is. And there's a lot of confusion of, for instance, stocks and flows or real and financial assets. They're not well distinguished, and then eventually the distinction between needs and wants. Okay, this is also in some sense an ideological. People who operate within that realize this is an ideological fight about what is a need and what is a want. Okay, within our economy, and so they're purposely blurred within the dominant neoclassical economic framework. So anyway, so what we're facing right now is, and this is the more recent episode about the Republicans talk about a more cartoonish and more almost laughably childish view of the economy and of how sort of superhero-like corporations and so forth and so on are so self-sufficient that they don't need government, and that they're, and that the government is simply an imposition upon the creativity and the productivity of capitalists or of corporations, really. And this is far from the reality that there's a web of interdependency and interconnection between different institutions, also different businesses, so forth and so on. And it is rare that either a company or a individual sort of stands alone, is able to, conform to this image of the sort of titan of the economy, titan of industry that somehow makes everything happen and progress in some sense in the form of economic progress, production of better goods and services and so forth and so on, that they stand alone. Rather, this progress happens because of the interaction of a lot of different groups within the economy, and there are different roles, or if they're not slated roles, that they find roles with each other, and that they create different opportunities for them. Some of them are parasitic, and some of them are subtractive of the really the general welfare, but they are able to accumulate for themselves some of the welfare. Some wealth. So this fantasy economics of the right is supported by, or it's a cousin of, this more respectable fantasy economics, and that in that fantasy economics is an economics of sort of an abstracted market that works magically, that one needs to only tweak indirectly through various means, that its workings are obscure and are hard to discern, and they require delicacy often, and the ideal sort of lever for this view of the economy is the interest rate. To raise and lower interest rates, what the Fed does, is somehow the key to better economic management, and that should be questioned. That shouldn't be, or if it is questioned, it's only in soft tones and not directly challenged. Okay, so but there's a growing chorus of people who are questioning the wisdom, for instance, of Jerome Powell's policy of continuing to raise interest rates, and also the very explicit rationales. It's in some sense the veil that I may have mentioned, or the cloud of ink that I mentioned, just before, and also in a previous episode, that cloud, that veil, has slipped somewhat, in that Jerome Powell has talked about, actually inflicting harm or damage on workers and consumers because they're too strong, that they're creating the inflation, or somehow this is what I do, even if he can't really make the statement that they're he's not a brilliant economist, or neither. I mean, the Fed employs some good economists, but overall, the organization of the Fed and the Treasury, so forth and so on, is so based on this, or swims in a soup of different economic ideas that doesn't clearly recognize and then broadcast and then inform the public and inform the administration and inform businesses of the actual reality. And this is because, again, in economics that did the things that I think an economics should do, in other words, to inform people how best to, depends on who you're addressing, inform governments about how best to manage the economy, how best to build, broad prosperity, also to preserve the real wealth of the world, of the society, by not damaging the biosphere, not damaging the climate, or by repairing that damage that we've created in the climate, largely by that we largely have created, and we humans. So that should be, and it's really quite devastating. It's not. I mean, there are some important issues that should be addressed economically, but we are nowhere near addressing them in our public discourse about how to do exactly these things, because economics is meant to be a distraction. And we see this from the structure of the economic profession in business, among other places. In other words, there are some economists that are employed as sort of auxiliary helpers in various businesses, and mostly on Wall Street, and also in a few other places. And but they are used as sort of a trickle of information that helps sort of guide the overall decision making of the business, that has very little to do with what academic economics proposes, because it's not a realistic economics. It's a fantasy economics. So, and it's based on a fantasy that is about distraction. Even it's not really a very gratifying fantasy. Let's say it's not the right-wing version is the more gratifying one in terms of fantasy world. In terms of it's more delusional. It's more extreme, but it's more exciting because it's based on this sort of worship, this idolatry of the wealthy and of the ruling class, and it's and therefore for some people exciting or potential, or gives you the potential as a aspirant to be a helper, to be considered to be a potential employee, or whatever, to get a donation from, to be patronized, to become a client, so to speak, of those people. That it's more exciting to imagine them to be so powerful and so amazing and so generative of our wealth in our society. And but the sort of mainstream fantasy economics is kind of dry and dismal in that way, and that dismalness helps it do its function of being this kind of obscuring discipline, this obscuring set of ideas that really need to be shucked for the most part. Not each, and there are bits and pieces of it that are worth preserving and worth looking at, but in general, it's a misdirection of the attention of ordinary people, of political leaders and business leaders, misdirection to issues that are irrelevant. And as I say, it basically needs to be outgrown by most of the people who actually do the work of either business or in the government, so forth and so on, except for very, very specific reporting functions of, for instance, the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department. So, and those are really an outgrowth of accountancy, which is a very useful discipline, and has been left behind by economics. Economics doesn't base itself strongly upon accounting, which is a basic and key function in government and business. So, but anyway, talking specifically now about the upcoming potential default of the United States on its obligations through not raising the debt ceiling, there is a solution that's written in federal law that Joe Biden can authorize the Treasury to mint a coin, a platinum coin, in some denomination of $1 trillion or more, that will, for the time being, meet the obligations of the government and potentially also enable government to spend some more money that's not yet been allocated, if it's a big enough denomination of a coin. So, but anyway, it's really a symbolic representation of something that's there is in a potential in any monetarily sovereign government like the United States, like Australia, like Great Britain, like taken as a whole, the Eurozone, but it's not. It's a little more complicated there because there's no fiscal agency. But theoretically, they could be a super state / monetary sovereign if they, change some of their laws and so forth and so on. But anyway, this ability of monetarily sovereign governments to create liquidity, to create and inject liquidity into the economy, in this case by in order to meet your obligations to remain solvent, okay, as a entity by creating liquidity. So, and that's something that can happen very quickly, as we learned in 2008, 2009, and also during wartime. So it's not something that's very obscure. But anyway, both Janet Yellen and Joe Biden and so forth and so on are not forthrightly embracing this solution and saying, look, Republicans, you can decide or not decide to raise the debt ceiling. We're just going to mint the coin, okay, and get us out of this situation. And the markets everyone can breathe a sigh of relief, not just the markets, the entire economy. This is potentially something that will not just our economy, many economies will affect them. So, but the heartstrings of many of the more respectable elites like Biden and Powell and Yellen are partly in awe of this, or share the fantasy world of the right wing in a muted form, in that they are either, I mean, in the case of Powell, he's essentially a ruling class capitalist, whatever, turned public. I guess you'd call him a public servant, but anyway, just a administrator of a bank that is the Federal Reserve Bank, the central bank of a central banker, you could say. All right, but also from the private sector in his origin and so forth and so on. And anyway, this they are all in the same. And Biden is someone who goes behind closed doors and reassures business people, student mutual, the ruling class, the donor class, people who are investors, business people. Makes it sound like they really have. Some of them do have a business which they really manage, but some of them are just people with lots of money who have donated a lot of money to him and or own lots of stock and shares in various companies or are private equity moguls, or they're not necessarily people who tend to a business in the virtuous sense that we think of as being someone who looks after their business. And so and then that's something that I'll bring up in future episodes about where are the virtues in a world that we need, that with this great inequality, where people want to see a greater, like I want to see a greater role for the public sector in our economy in a whole host of areas, but I also want to not create this dichotomy that we've seen in previous left theory about the evils of businesses and the management of enterprises and how that works, and also the potential what kind of gains do individuals they have if they are good at doing those things that are I would argue that are of value even in a world where it's dominated by a public sector and by many cooperatives and worker ownership or worker participation in the management, the executive management of companies. But anyway, that big mega issue aside, right now, what I'm talking about here is a fantasy economics that is the cousin of the people who are doing the stupid thing of trying to shut down the world economy and reneging on our obligations, and they are both sort of in different ways blind people, even though one is blinder, let's say, is more blind and stupid, and the other is just the victim of a similar ideology, but smarter and also more flexible, let's say, in their beliefs in the same ideology, that they sort of realize that reality intrudes. We have this fantasy economics that we have to sustain. We can't push it aside and look at the economy, look at the actual functions of the government, of the monetary operations of the government, which is something that modern monetary theory is very clear on, and is very has basically done the research and shows the reality of that, and constantly reports on the changes in that reality, but still that there are these monetary operations of a monetary sovereign that are an important part of your picture of the macroeconomy, of the overall economy, and not just a deviation, from the fantasy economics that's taught in 95% of economics programs, not only just here in the United States, all throughout the world. It's a global fantasy economics. And so anyway, so this the fact that the people who are calling the Republicans stupid and or kamikaze, or not that word, but nihilists, so forth and so on, they are also in thrall to some of the same ideas about the economy. They just say, well, realistically, we have to do these rituals. We have to do this ritual, but still worship in this ritual that's not in the raising of the debt ceiling. It sounds terrible. It's like, why you look in the context of why go into quote unquote more debt, and so this is what the sort of naive people on the right wing, or quote unquote naive, who are using this as a cudgel, they're just saying, well, look, you said this is, we're raising a debt ceiling, that's a bad thing. And meanwhile, Joe Biden and so forth and so on, and the Congress could have just said, let's get rid of this ritual let's forever, and we won't have this raising the debt ceiling, which is definitely a possibility, and it would avoid also the other ritual, which is legal, of minting a $1 trillion coin or a multi-trillion-dollar coin to enable to maintain the liquidity of the federal government to continue to basically support its obligation to be able to be solvent in and not to default on its obligations. Okay, so anyway, so this fantasy economics is I think it's a valuable way to think about how people are approaching this and why we have this weird interaction here in right now between, but on the one hand, Joe Biden and Janet Yellen, and the other hand, the Congress, where they're part of the same game, but they're seeing the fantasy economics differently. One sees a political opportunity within it to realize it's still more fantastic and ideas about the economy that has no government, and the other one saying, well, we have to do these rituals that say we worship the same God, so to speak, but we have to do these other things just because that's what the reality is, because we're adults, so to speak, rather than saying, well, no, we don't worship the same God. You're in you have misconceptions about how economies work, how government works, and they're misconceptions that we don't share. We realize it's confusing. You're confused by the language, but we'll just get rid of that. We'll just get rid of the debt ceiling. Okay, we won't have to go through this anymore. Okay, because it has no use anymore. And if we have an issue, the issue of whether the government spends too much money is a question of whether or not it will cause inflation. And right now, our inflation has nothing to do with government spending, or has very, very slightly to do with government spending during the pandemic. In other words, it's mostly about corporate price gouging, the exertion of market power by companies, and also some real shortages that are still being worked out through the system, through our supply chains in the system. Less and less so. That was more the case 2 or 3 years ago, or 2 years ago. But anyway, so and we get some of these ideas about supply chains and about what I was just discussing. Those are all happen to be things that economists sometimes talk about, but they're not part of this high church of economic ideas, okay, that are embedded in laws and so forth, about debt and about money and where does money come from and what is the role of government in an economy, and the government is in fact integral to the economy. It's not something that sits on top of the economy. But the whole academic economic fantasy, the fantasy world it creates, suggests that the government really it's not really critical. It's something that sort of darts in and out, but it's something that's been sort of lumped onto the fundamental model of supply and demand and markets, and sort of doing black magic around them by raising and lowering interest rates. And in this case, the black magic that Powell is trying to do, which is more obvious, is simply to discipline workers, to reassert a economic hierarchy without solving the problem, and to exaggerate again the wealth disparities in our economy, and our economic power disparities in our economy by making life harder for workers by raising interest rates. So on top of that, the debt ceiling is a slightly different issue, but it's part of a there's an overall the Republicans are taking a slightly different approach to this by saying, well, let's just remove the support of government and for ordinary people, and that will while keeping it in reality for the wealthy. So that that punish, and it will be, essentially will be punishing people for being needy and also being different, being different than the ideal. Okay, different than the ideal that they share. In fact, different from them, who they are in reality, but their fantasy of this totally self-sufficient, wealthy, white Christian, most often male individual in the economy that is, property owning and potentially, either comfortably wealthy or, also part of the group of people who makes claims about all their wonderful generativity, their wonderful Western civilization, so forth, so on, their wonderful Christian civilization, and how much superior it is to everyone else's. So anyway, so I think this idea of a fantasy economics is important. I think it helps us to sort of see, well, what is the real economics? How it's so crucial for both government leaders and also ordinary people and politicians and business people, for that matter, to realize what is the real economy, what's going on in reality, and how can we promote broad prosperity and also create sustainable prosperity for all peoples. And so this is something that is it's the fantasy economics just takes you far away from that, okay, or it freezes you, okay. So in other words, we have paralysis. Another way to think about this is a paralysis due to people who are prey to these fantasies. Anyway, I hope this concept is of some help to you in your thinking about politics and economics, and also the upcoming fights in Congress, and also between the administration and Congress, and between the Federal Reserve and administration and Congress, and the Treasury Department, so forth and so on. And I hope it can create a stronger movement toward rational fiscal policy, rational economic policy, rational ecological policy for governments, and social policy overall as well. So anyway, so if you enjoyed this video, please like it. And if you are enjoying Politics 2100 in general, please subscribe. And also, by the way, please share your comments in the comments below about what I'm advancing here. And I hope I'll see you in the next video.